The show is using the split diopter as a hinge to talk about technical optics and about psychological implications of using those technical devices.
The split diopter fundamentally is a kind of bifocal lens that can be put over the lens of the camera and allow a camera to register objects very near and far and give them the same level of resolution or focus.
The split diopter ostensibly creates focus in the deep recess horizon on one side of the frame and in the immediate foreground on the other side.
The split diopter does not give us this perfectly smooth image. In fact, it gives us a kind of scarred image with this blurred seam running down the center as a reminder of the space of the invisible, the not visualizable. And that fundamentally is a poetic space.
It's an exhibition that has many different elements related to, coming from, in response to, because of cinema.
What we were trying to do is to extrude certain elements from the object that is a film. And that might include such things as the prop, the backdrop, the film poster, the film still, and then finally the soundtrack.
The exhibition is comprised of a documentary that brings together 5 artists and a production designer that talk about their work. And we paired it with individual works by 7 artists that all work with these ideas in various ways.
Here I am in the space of the documentary that's sort of speaking to you as an audience member about a lot of the same conceits and themes that you find in the exhibition, giving you a more personal feel, a more idiosyncratic reaction to a lot of these thoughts directly from these artists who work at the seam of art and cinema. This film engages a very full spectrum of artists that use the tactics or the strategies of cinema in so many different ways. Bill Jones, somebody who uses the cell phone in almost like a slideshow manner to sort of break down the fundamentals of cinema such that what's left is the sort of lyricism that one brings to the cinematic voice. We have both Stan Douglas and Lynn Marsh who utilize all of the techniques and equipment of cinema, turning that equipment onto itself in a kind of Brechtian way. The equipment becomes the kind of subject. The dance of the equipment within the process of filmmaking is oftentimes the choreography that you'll see within their work. We have Liam Young, somebody who's known as a world builder who uses the full spectrum of visual effects, almost to say that we don't even need to go film things anymore. We don't need to take the camera out into the world. Jeffrey Stucker uses a complete virtual camera in all of his work. So everything that he does is CGI. Here we have Patty Podesta, production designer, who works in the space of Hollywood, who in that space is making work about space, about depth. Patty's work is often dealing with a kind of endless horizon, redefining what the horizon is or how one can speak potentially about the idea of a horizon.
We spend a lot of time talking about the horizon with regard to our current imaging regime and thinking forward to a point where images become so resolved, so high in informational content, nothing even at the greatest distances would fail to be recorded with absolute precision. What happens to the horizon in an image like that? Can you still have a aesthetic experience at that point?
This piece by Uda Bart, titled Field Number 9, while it appears to be out of focus, it could be said to be the most in focus piece in the whole show.
Although we would tend to see this picture as out of focus for photo vision, there really is no such a thing as out of focus. A camera's always focusing on something, and in this case, it's focusing on that slice of atmosphere that is actually rendered with absolute precision.
The out-of-focusness of the image brings in focus the actual device, the lens through which we're seeing the image.
For the field series, I drove around LA trying to find locations that lacked specificity, that allowed me to make images that were really generalized. It was sort of like location scouting for a film, and I had certain films in mind or certain kinds of scenes in mind. I didn't want specific references to any particular film, but I had a sort of general ambience in mind when I was looking for things. And then when I show the work, people often come up to me and tell me that they know exactly where a particular image is taken. And I'm always sort of curious, and they're 100% convinced, and they're 100% wrong. The field series has a whole different kind of compositional language to it. The images are not composed around a center. They're not composed in relationship to the edge. The images flow off the edges.
Similarly, John Devola uses velocity in his photography. This picture is from a series called Dogs Chasing My Car in the Desert. While the dog is in relative focus, the sand underneath the dog and the bush next to it are out of focus. A motion blur occurs as the artist pans the camera along with the moving dog.
One of the early moves towards cinema was an attempt to depict through still frames the image of animals and people moving. Edward Muybridge's whole series of human and animal locomotion studies is certainly a precedent for his photographs.
From about the mid-90s, 95 to 97, 98, I was photographing these isolated houses around 29 Palms and Joshua Tree. In the process of photographing those isolated houses, I would notice dogs chasing my car. I had, at the time, a 35mm camera with a motor drive, and I thought, well, why not bring along that camera loaded with black and white film? So that's how it started. And I've got this material, which is celluloid with this silver salts on it, and this very grainy silver salts. I'm thinking that I'm going to make prints out of these, and I'm interested in the kind of pointillism of that grain in the photographic paper and how the subjects within the image begin to almost kind of dissolve in relation to resolve in the image.
This piece here by Alex Israel called Rosebud is a direct replica of the sled that was used in Citizen Kane. But it just goes to show that we boil down the objects that we use to create the images on the big screen to their most essential function so that they will read as an icon of that object. And often we're disappointed when we see actual sets because they fall short with regards to how they read on camera.
My work has always been made in close contact with the entertainment industries, and particularly Hollywood. The Warner Brothers carpentry shop made the sled based on photos and dimensions that I resourced and extrapolated from a combination of old auction catalogs and film and production stills. And then the Warner Brothers scenic artist painted the wooden object and made it look aged. In all my studying of props, I've simply come to one conclusion about their aesthetic commonality, and that's their ability to express glints of aura.
These two pieces by Hedy L. use imagery from two movies. We see on the one hand Kim Novak in Vertigo, and on the other we see Delphine Seyrig in Last Year at Marienbad.
These two works were culled from a large and ongoing collection. They are particularly relevant from the perspective of this show. Alfred Hitchcock's cinematographer on Vertigo, Robert Burks, and Alain René's cinematographer on Last Year at Marienbad, Sacha Verny, both made ample use of the split diopter in these films to create hallucinatory effects. This work to me relates to the film still, but of course when you blow it up in the way that we've done for this show, it starts to incline more into the realm of the backdrop.
On a narrative level, both reflect the split that occurs in the lens, and they both deal with simultaneity of storylines. In Vertigo, we have essentially a doubling of the original story that is interspersed with dream sequences, and in Last Year at Marienbad, you never really know where you are on the timeline, where you are geographically, and what the relationship between the two protagonists is.
Growing up in Morocco, I started buying film magazines and reading about cinema history, and often I saw stills from movies before I could see the actual movie. I've accumulated now 30 years worth of magazines. And I went through them and I started building these little collages that were not necessarily artistic, but to me, they were like a way of making a diagram of a certain kind of trajectory of an acquisition of culture and how one thing led to another thing, and then one thing made you understand something else. So it's not necessarily like a juxtaposition, it's more of a matching a register of intensity. I mean, I feel like they document a kind of sense of alienation that culture produces.
This work by Matthew Brannan, titled Split Diopter Spring 1962, splits the viewer's attention in three ways. We're looking at movie posters that were put out for the release of the French movie last year at Marienbad, and we're looking at the French version and at the American version. We can infer things about those cultures from the movie poster, starting with the font, the use of space, and also the use of language in the American poster that creates images through language, whereas the French poster is quite satisfied with giving hints. Just a title is enough here. We have a third location that is undisclosed, described at the bottom of the posters, which is a reportage of the disappearance of two warplanes that went missing in the time prior to the Vietnam War, but coinciding with the release of last year at Marienbad. So Matthew Brannan's work picks up on the split in narration or split in attention that is implied by the split diopter device on a picture plane, but here on the plane of life, I suppose.
These two silkscreen works were produced specifically for this show. They are based on two posters promoting the emblematic instance of Nouvelle Vague cinema that is last year at Marienbad. Their very different graphic designs remind us that film posters must not only offer an aesthetic foretaste of the works that they advertise, but must also adapt it to a specific cultural context. The garishly hyperbolic tone of the US version, really a world apart from its quaint French counterpart, nevertheless speaks to the long-lasting alliance between these two nations. Cemented during the years of the American Revolution, it would soon get drawn into the quagmire of the Vietnam conflict, a shared vanishing point that bound together the audiences of this film about forgetting, whether at home or abroad.
We decided to have a soundtrack for this exhibition to portray all of these works in a quasi-movie theater environment. We approached Lawrence English, who is an Australian composer.
What he did was try to transcribe the visual ambience of split diopter shots into an oral composition.
Lawrence emphasized the back and forth, the foreground background that is inherent in the split diopter by using different types of frequencies. So we hear low rumbles that are farther away and high pitches that are closer.
This soundtrack is transmitted through 4 speakers that are hidden in the space, mounted atop the walls and pointed up at the ceiling so as to only greet us on return, bouncing back from the top of the gallery. And I know Lawrence very much wanted us to experience his score coming down as a kind of mist. We also made a film which involves the dancers from the Chapman dance department. We shot the film in the space.
You can tell when this imagistic effect is reproduced in the post-production process. There's a slight look of authenticity that you get when you go with the actual split diopter, and so that's what we were looking for.
We marked off the field of vision of our camera on the floor of the gallery with tape so they could orient themselves as to where they were when they were out of the frame, when they were in the frame, at what point they were in focus, at what point they stepped out of focus.
We thought this type of dancing, this type of movement would be perfect for us to engage the actual split diopter lens. What you normally see in a shot when Hollywood uses a split diopter is something that's generally fairly static. There isn't a lot of movement that goes on. We wanted to kind of subvert that and take the split diopter that has this seam down the middle and bring that to the fore. And what you have with a group of dancers that are using the seam as a kind of center point, you have the subversion of the split diopter as much as you have an embrace of it.